The show must go on.
The show
Said you
must
were
go
beat. You
on.
had a rough day again in the markets.
Rough week, pretty much.
What do you do?
I work in an investment bank. I work in the markets division, and I've been trying to keep up every day the past post-Liberation Day, day that
You
we've had.
you're keeping up, and you're keeping us up.
Yeah.
Frankly, I mean, I appreciate it. I'm not. I work at a bank. Not. And I find getting a download once a week from you, kind of saying how the market, quote unquote, people, investors, and stuff are responding to what's happening, to be really valuable in my day to day. It's not super critical. It's not exactly what I do, but there's a lot of, it's very helpful context. So, I mean, I appreciate it.
I definitely try. So just like in my course of day to day, I obviously try to keep up with all the major asset classes, all the major events that might be influencing those things. And, you try to put the pieces together and make some sense of the world. Day to day, normal times, it's pretty much steady as she goes. Maybe something funny will happen, something confusing, but it's some kind of localized thing. It's specific to maybe a region or an asset class or something like that.
Something happens
But
in some country that might affect some
yeah,
demand or supply of some asset.
but this past week, this has been one of those weeks where effectively every day it's just like trying to keep your head above water just constantly. March 2020 COVID is the closest thing we've got to this, which is kind of strange. So it's like order of magnitude moves that we've seen in major markets are just about the same size. These just intense swings back and forth. We're seeing, in U.S. equity indices going up and down intraday, 10+% back and forth, from being down a few percent, which is a huge move, to then suddenly being up a few percent based on whatever next headline came out. And it's just a truly massive move. And whenever things start moving this much, this quickly, this violently, even, you could say, the system's not perfect. And it can't withstand.
And one of the things I think you kind of
pretty much
mentioned
just
was the VIX. Bam. So, like, what this is, the volatility index. This sounds like what you're describing. Just stuff's moving around a whole lot.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah, go back to like the 5-year button there. So it's, it doesn't look too bad, but we're right at the kind of edge of COVID there. What if you do max? See what that looks like, so we can get the. All right, so there you go. We see COVID there. We're like, they kind of average this thing out a little bit on this longer time scale. But, we're like over 60 there. People thought the world was going to end over COVID. March 2020, those
That's
early
true.
days.
Bring everyone back. That's true. We forget about that.
That was a dark, scary time. It was a dark, like, joking aside, that was a really tough time. People were, losing faith
No, you're right.
in everything.
You're right.
It's like there's this tail risk that this virus is out there and it's going to make people deathly ill at a mass scale. And if that happens, society could break down. So that's where we were over COVID. 2008, it was like people didn't think the world was going to end, but people thought that the global financial system was going to end. So, that would be pretty bad as well, but I guess not as bad as yourself and all your family dying of some virus.
Yeah. And here we go. This is trade. This was a total financial disaster. This was a natural disaster. And this is Trump tariffs.
Now we've got presidential disaster. And that's one of the most painful things that has been going around. It's the perception
you feel like
that
it's self-inflicted.
Precisely. That's what everyone's been saying. People are baffled. Like, why in the world would anyone conceive of doing this? But so that's in this class of people that are working in this day to day. And to a traditional economics background, like we've talked about on the show quite a bit now, tariffs are a bad idea. Everything says they're not good. But like we were touching on at the end of last week, after Liberation Day, and we talked about it previously as well, there really wasn't free trade. Trump has been continuously spinning this, of course, as I'm doing what needs to be done. I'm being courageous. I'm taking this massive risk to do what needs to be done to reset trade, to effectively reset the global trading order. And obviously, many people disagree with him. and it's been really a hell of a week, to be quite honest. But today, actually, we started to see a little bit of relief finally. So we're basically a full 7 days from the Liberation Day announcement. Things have finally cooled down. Starting last week, like we said, people went to bed Wednesday night on Liberation Day. He made the announcement on purpose after financial markets had closed because he knew it was going to be a rough one. The next day, everyone was like, "What?" Just like totally shell shocked. No one knew what was going on. Everyone was hoping it's like, okay, Canada, Mexico, we've seen these things play out like rapid back and forths, and it ultimately ended up being nothing. So I think at the end of last week, that was just like everyone was on like a hope and a prayer that more or less something like that was going to play out. So it was like Thursday, it's like just no one knew what was going on. Volatility began. Come Friday, just more of the same. Really, nothing happened. Trump kind of went into the background after this Liberation Day announcement. It's rare for him to do this, but he purposely stepped out of the spotlight. And so people left the workday on Friday going into the weekend with a very strong conviction that there's going to be some sort of emergency announcement over the weekend from Trump or from the administration, which materially tones things down. People were very convinced of that, just given
Yeah.
how volatile things were, how non-traditional this move was, and how really nonsensical most people thought that this move was. But that didn't happen. In fact, over the weekend, we saw just the opposite. We saw Trump dispatch his key cabinet members, so mostly Lutnick and Bessent, Commerce and Treasury Secretary, those that are really the key figures in this, how this is being rolled out. And he put them on all the news stations. He just put them out there just to reinforce what's happened. It's like, we're doubling down on this. This is not going anywhere. Every interview, and like I wish I had some picked out right now that I had
Oh
seen. It's
no.
every interview at the start was like, are the question was like, are these tariffs real? And then Bess is just like, yes, President Trump made an announcement about tariffs and he was not joking. It's just like, what
Oh
do you want me to
no.
say? So just really pushed back hard, or, reinforced it over the weekend. So China retaliated. So I think I do have something here.
Actually, I got a
And,
couple teed up.
oh, really? Nice.
Yeah, a
Oh,
couple
there
that
we
I
go.
found. I think we really should, I think, go to kind of the source. If nothing else, we can go directly to the Chinese news,
Yeah.
which is basically, yeah, the PR arm of the government itself. So even if we don't necessarily know exactly like what they think, we can at least decipher how it is they want to be perceived.
This is like Xi Jinping's Truth Social here.
Right.
A little,
Um,
little more structured, a little more measured, but more boring. Come on now. This
right.
is a show.
我们不热事，也不怕事儿. Um, you know, it's like we start trouble, but we're not afraid of trouble either. And it's really interesting if you actually go to their source to see what kind of tone they want to strike. I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but the U.S. tariffs have angered the world, so you can see them starting to fight for the narrative here. But when dealing with the Chinese, we don't like pressure and threats. We don't cause trouble, but we are not afraid of it either. Our first point is about dialogue. So urging. So Chinese speaking from their own perspective to their citizenry, urging the U.S. to immediately correct its wrong practices, cancel all unilateral tariff measures against China, stop economic and trade suppression of China, and properly resolve differences with China. This is, I want to say, as someone who's lived in China about 4 years right after I graduated, I worked for a market research firm. And you start to get there are themes, definitely, of the communications that come out of Beijing through their propagandistic arm, let's call it. There is a very strong one in which they depict any action that the U.S. takes through the lens of this is trying to stop the rise of China. That is a very, very common theme. And so when I read this, it's just like I've read this a million times. Suppressing China. That's the message. So yeah, the U.S. is well aware of the cause of the harm it's caused. So this is another thing that certainly when I was living abroad, so I lived in Russia and China. And they very much take advantage. Take advantage is maybe not the proper term, but because the U.S. is, call it, more open, and there are just competing factions that are doing it publicly. Like, I mean, it's from like the Chinese perspective, it's very strange to see two halves of a government like yell at each other and debate at stuff. And this allows them the ability to basically go and adopt whatever narrative or view that they want, kind of for their own purposes, put it forward, and say, they themselves don't even agree, right? When really it's just kind of half. It's like the Democrats speaking about Republicans or Republicans speaking about Democrats. So when they say like something is going to sue the U.S., something in the U.S. is going to sue the U.S. government, then they must be doing something wrong. So the U.S. threat to escalate tariffs on China is a mistake on top of a mistake, which once again exposes the U.S.'s blackmail nature. China will never accept it. If the U.S. insists on its own way, China will fight to the end. So this is something that was sort of bouncing around. That was the big quote. So then they started talking about their own countermeasures against the U.S., more than 20 countermeasures. So they imposed tariffs on U.S. agricultural products and energy.
Their initial response was retaliation. So on Liberation Day, every country got their number, but China's number was an additional 34% tariffs. We'll fight to the end, and we're also imposing an additional 34% across the board on all US goods coming into China. That was the differentiating thing so far. That has set China apart from the rest of the world in this debacle. They were the only one to come out and do that. And it's been very interesting to see the week unfold. Made a post like in all caps saying, China played it wrong. You got to be cool, everyone.
One of the ways that I saw kind of posting around, I don't know, part of the conversation on X anyway, is trying to label it as, oh, this is a masterstroke by Trump, for he was able to really filter out the good actors from the bad ones. So China has identified itself because it immediately went to retaliation as a quote unquote bad actor, whereas everyone else kind of came to the table.
Throughout this whole time, everyone's very uncertain. The message that they're delivering is play it cool. These numbers are a ceiling. Come and talk with us and we can figure it out. And so it was just nothing but damage control those first few days, trying to hammer home that message. And then once the work week began on Monday, there were beginning early talks with the Japanese prime minister, with South Korea. And it's basically the start of countries coming to the table. Over the weekend, China just gave their retaliation. Yesterday, China issued retaliatory 34%. On top of their already record setting tariffs, non monetary tariffs, illegal subsidization of companies, and massive long term currency manipulation. If China does not withdraw this retaliation, on April 8th, the next day, the United States will impose additional tariffs of 50% effective April 9th. And April 9th was the original implementation date for these non standard 10% across the board tariffs, the country specific ones. So you're saying, you've got a day to think about this, but instead of 34% and 54, we're going to go to 104. So there we go. Trade war is on. And China said, "All right, you want to play ball? We're going to do 50 as well. We're going to match you again." At this point, financial markets have been melting down now for multiple days in a row. Usually whenever these things happen, you'll have a big shock event. You maybe saw off 1 or 2 days. Then you get a knee-jerk reaction back upward, then back downward. It was nothing but just straight red everywhere. So people are watching this escalation between China and the US, but very quiet from the rest of the world. Once China said they're going to retaliate for a second time, now we're going to add an additional 84% on all of US imports. Then Trump said, based on lack of respect, China has shown to the world markets, raising to 125% effective immediately. Within this same post, just as big or bigger, then at the bottom, he's saying, countries that have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the U.S., he's going to authorize a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period, also effective immediately. So this is the first little bit of relief. People were waiting for him to just kind of say, gotcha, just kidding, on the tariffs around the world, almost exactly like he did with Canada and Mexico twice, and left China alone and added to theirs twice. So this is effectively, to me, feels like the third time that he's doing this, almost like he's doing this reciprocal tariff regime, but he's really just reverting back to telling the world, listen, I am not happy with this. The United States is not happy with this. We're going to do something about it now. So you can get on board or not, or you can fight us. In all of those scenarios, everyone's played nice, more or less. And there was silence from China. I don't think the US administration made much material effort, if any, to reach out to the Chinese. I think they were waiting for the Chinese to reach out to them. But it just never happened. This was a big standoff. This turned into a big game of chicken. Who's going to blink first? Trump took some pressure off non-China while just continuing to dial up the pressure on China more and more and more. At the start, looking at some of those posts, looking at those communications like you were talking about, Luke, they obviously wanted the world to be more on their side. They were going into the narrative, look at what Trump is doing. This is illegal. This is a bully, whatever you want to call it. And I'm sure they were hoping for a scenario where everyone diverts their trade from the U.S. into China. If the U.S. is going to relieve pressure on everyone else, now there is still some pressure. There's still 10% across the board, which is still very large. But just in comparison to what we've seen throughout this week, it feels like a huge relief. Now it's China against the U.S. against the world.
It's interesting that you mentioned in there how, they wanted to isolate China, because when you look at that news article that I showed you a minute ago, they also say that the U.S. is isolating itself. Yeah, it's a good, I'll send it to you after. Maybe we can include a link or just kind of breeze through it. But let me read kind of farther down. We are well aware. So it's not clear who we are. I'm guessing the Chinese someone in
The Chinese
China.
people.
Chinese people. We are well aware that the U.S. government wants to subvert the global free trade system with the WTO at its core, and we naturally have to stand together with all anti-hegemonic forces in the world. So, you can imagine this is how they're going to be painting the U.S. They're attacking the global free trade system, presumably, China, of which is now the main defender of free trade. Which, again, and we've sort of
Which is
talked about
kind
this
of
before.
ironic.
It's very ironic.
They're not. They're just opposing what the U.S. is doing.
Yeah, exactly. They're not. So Trump made it very clear in that report that he devoted 50 or 60 pages or whatever devoted to showing why China is not a proponent and a defender of free trade. But it gets it gets better. It's like China firmly defends its own development rights and interests, which echoes the world's defense of the multilateral trading system. So again, harping on that. When the United States isolates itself from the global free trade circle, other countries in the world can also choose to truly, quote unquote, isolate the United States. So now, like, both sides are kind of harping to try to say that the other one is the one being isolated. It's easy for them to kind of pull. Naturally, Western countries debate these things out, and they do it publicly. So you can pull quotes, one of which, the Canadian Prime Minister, for 8 decades, the United States has assumed the role of global economic leader, built alliances based on trust and mutual respect, and championed the free and open exchange of goods and services. That era has ended. It is a tragedy, but it is also a new reality. This is something that I noticed, Russian media does as well. When I lived there, it's so easy. We give them all the material.
Wait, sorry. What do you mean by that?
If you're writing this from the perspective from China, it's very easy for you to show why your position is the correct one, when you can say even they themselves think this, when in reality they're just pulling from one voice amidst 1,000 open yelling voices that is kind of a healthy democratic system in which you publicly debate these things out. They can pull a quote from someone on that side, quote unquote. They know when they elicit Canada, West, US, West. Oh, look at these fractures that are happening within the West. They agree with us. They don't like the US. Here's a quote. They're not mentioning everyone else who agrees with Trump, because it's not, they can just pick and choose what quotes. And they'll put it another way. It's like if you are a PR firm or a lawyer, let's say, and you're tasked with arguing one side, and you're free to pull whatever quotes you want, and you're pulling it from the West, where people are talking all sorts of stuff all the time. Imagine
You can build something very compelling.
Imagine the case that you can build, and just feeding so many great quotes just constantly. And I was saying that this is something I've also noticed in Russian media, for instance.
Got it.
And it's kind of frustrating.
Right, because at least in the US, there's constant bickering, but at least you know people's positions. Tariffs at this level effectively stop all trade between the
Right.
US and
Exactly.
China.
Yeah, I thought you would say that. I mean, after a certain point, it's like, who cares if it's 100% or 1,000%? It's like, you're not
It's going to go to zero now.
right.
And you think, like, who's got the stronger position right now? Who has more to lose in that scenario? Just on a sheer balance of payments level, China clearly has more to lose. So
Right. That's Besant came out and said that.
China both exports more than the U.S., like over twice as much, I think, or somewhere in that area, and their economy is like 2/3 of the size of the U.S.
Yeah.
So, as a share of their total GDP, that amount of exports
Right.
going to zero would be a major hit.
Yeah. That would
And
be, yeah, a reasonable hit. I think I was looking at some numbers earlier. I think the net export number is like 3%. So from just like a sheer numbers perspective, China has more to lose. Just and Besant came out and said this, say that anytime these negotiations happened, it's the one that has the larger surplus that's going to hurt more.
it's a big surplus.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean though that China can't cause pain in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, and they will. But I think the other big point is how unified the messaging needs to be. One of the biggest items of the Communist Party is that they must, like you've talked about before, Luke, they must ensure and deliver stability. And you can only do that if you have legitimacy. And everybody knows that it's to some level, there's a little bit of massaging of the numbers of economic data that comes out of China, but they're in the ballpark. They say they target, like the official target now is, quote, like around 5%. Okay, you can nudge that around a little bit. But if you're already below 5%, like they are today, and something goes to zero all of a sudden, and very easy back of the envelope math, if you know it's going to be something like 3%, having that trade go to zero, if the Chinese government comes out and says we're at 5% still, to me, that seems like it would be a major hit to the legitimacy.
So then it would kind of draw the question of when legitimacy of like statistics or like published statistics. It was that Solzhenitsyn quote where it's like, we knew they were lying. They knew they were lying. We knew they knew that they were lying, and they lied anyway. It's like,
Right.
what could be more evidence of just raw power? I got kind of like a story about that in terms of like the numbers coming out of China that I could share. When I started work, so I just graduated university. I was living in Beijing. This is like 2010, looking for a job, found one to do market research. One of the things that we would do a lot of was like cross-checking. It was like just information cross-checking. So if we were tasked with trying to figure out the total size of like the automotive coatings market, so car paint, imagine, we would get, we might conduct interviews with the major suppliers. That would be kind of a supply side view of it. And we kind of would get a kind of broad sense of how large the market is on that side. But then you need to really check that number. You can't really have it come from one source. So you got to just do some sanity checks. So you got to say like, okay, how many cars are there in China? And sort of compare it against that number. How often do people get their
You
stuff
sold cars
repainted?
to paint 100 million cars this year,
Right,
and
exactly.
20 were sold, huh?
Yeah, exactly. You could go to demand side and you can start asking like repair shops, like, how many cars do you paint? How often? They're happy to tell you this stuff. And then you kind of look at it from a bunch of different angles to try to like, ballpark and get more and more confident that one number is right. And my manager at the time, so my boss, so the person who owned the company, I guess he was reviewing my work or something and felt as though I was relying too much on government statistics. He was basically like, I would put forward some of these numbers that were published officially from the China statistics, and I would be like, okay, well, this is it. This is the number. And he kept being like, no, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Eventually, I guess he got kind of fed up with it because he was like, look, take some time. Don't do your normal day job. But what I want you to do is to conduct the same exercise that you do with our reports. So really try to cross-check a number and try to find if it's wrong. And that's what I did. So I went out and I started looking at energy numbers. I started there. People might say that you don't necessarily trust sort of like the top line growth numbers, but if you can see that there's like a gradual increase in the amount of like electricity consumption or something, they can use that in place of growth, for instance. So that's kind of where I started. And long story short, I looked into it and I was basically trying to compare from the amount of coal that was used to generate a certain amount of electricity at a certain efficiency rate And it was just very clear that there's something wrong with these numbers because, when it got down to it, you started questioning how much physical energy is in like a ton of coal to produce so much electricity. And it's impossible to know which of the numbers are wrong, but just in like the simple formula of like, coal in, heat lost, energy produced, it just didn't add up. There was like electricity was way too high, the coal was either way too low, or what I thought it was just like the efficiency was just out. It was like getting to like impossible, like physically impossible numbers. Where like these efficiency ratios were like 70, 80%. And so that's when the cracks kind of started to appear for me when looking at like Chinese numbers.
And then, at a point like that, or, even right now, like, where do we go from here?
I mean, I guess we're going to see how much pain that one side can do to the other. So we've already started to see it from the China side. So again, going kind of on their primary sources here, they're starting to add 12 US entities to the export control list. And they started listing companies that I guess, kind of don't want to export them to. So I guess this is April 9 come into effect. So, start squeezing stuff there. There was, I guess adding even higher tariffs. We're going to start to get into, speculative territory in terms of how much damage that can be done. Well, what do you think is going to happen?
I do not know.
We have, but this is the funny thing is this has happened before. Trump was president before.
Not at this scale.
Not at this scale. That's true. It went back and forth a little bit. It ended up in an agreement. So this was back in 2018 or whatever when they kicked off this version of it, and they got to like a quote unquote phase one, in which China sort of agreed to start buying more U.S. goods. The tariffs were raised a little bit, and Biden when he came in, he didn't reduce them. Then COVID happened, and China never bought as much stuff as it said it would.
It wasn't enforced. It's basically like it never happened. But
yeah,
this scale is orders of magnitude larger. Anyway, just wanted to give I don't know how quick of an update that was, but just trying to keep up with the day-to-day here. Things are moving fast. Things are highly uncertain. I think we got a tiny bit of relief, but there's still monumental uncertainty with all of these individual bilateral trade agreements between the U.S. and every other trading partner in the world, effectively.
All right, we'll end with the kind of this thought. Do you think that this is the beginning of is this the first domino, so to speak, in Ray Dalio's view of the world? This is going to be the real start that changes the world order? Is this it? April 9th?
Dalio's thesis is that the U.S. can't remain the world reserve currency and all these other economic advantages indefinitely. Empires have risen and fallen through the centuries. There's kind of a natural progression of these things. So that happening to the U.S. and all of his metrics kind of point to that happening. And I think it's a pretty compelling argument. But what's the alternative? Right now, there really is no alternative. Still, something would need to take the place of America's core place in the global financial system, the world economic order. It's very unclear who could step into that right now. You could envision a world where maybe, things just completely fall apart and trade with the US around the world collapses. And then, almost by definition, the dollar wouldn't serve as a reserve currency anymore. People wouldn't go to U.S. treasuries to collateralize things not even related to the U.S. They wouldn't use it for that pure utility factor. Things, perhaps in that way, things could crumble and people naturally gravitate a little more towards China. But that kind of world is like a nationalistic, almost just very isolated. Individual countries have to maybe rebuild from scratch individual trading partnerships and other things like that. And if you're in that kind of world, it seems obvious to me that there's just so many additional things that then could go wrong between countries throughout the world, which then, could lead itself to some sort of conflict. And historically speaking, world orders get changed with wars and major conflicts. So I don't know. That seems possible as of today. I really hope that's not the case. But on the other side, maybe China comes to the table over the next few days.
Does the first domino hit the second one? Maybe is kind of the question.
We don't know right now if today was the first domino, like you said, or last week was the first, and now this is already the second.
Good point. That's a much better point. Maybe one of them would miss. Maybe this is just the natural order of things.
Yeah. Well, whatever you guys think, we'd be very interested to hear. So
Yeah.
drop a comment below. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, we got a comment last time.
Quit talking over each other. That was a good comment.
Was that a real one? Did we get that?
Yeah.
Oh, we did? Oh,
Yeah. Shout
all
out
right,
to
just
whoever said that.
good to know.
All right. Well, thanks
Thanks
for
for tuning
tuning
in.
in. I'm Joe.
I'm Luke. See you next time. Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.